The Richard Roeper Show is brought to you by AmericanEagle.com Studios. The digital landscape is changing rapidly, and to compete in today's online business environment, you need an experienced partner. Since 1995, AmericanEagle.com has partnered with companies of all sizes, offering web design, web development, e-commerce, mobile apps, and digital marketing to drive your overall business's success, because they believe that today's online world is your online opportunity. Visit AmericanEagle.com to get started today. That's AmericanEagle.com, AmericanEagle.com. Okay, some personal news, as they say on the Twitter and the X and all that stuff. Before we get into some interesting discussions, I hope they're going to be interesting. I just wanted to share with you guys, first of all, a couple of people in my, I don't want to say my inner circle, but just in my life have asked me, because I've taken on some recent other assignments and gigs, will the podcast continue? Of course it will. We will have fresh podcasts baked for you every week. But I'm pleased to announce that I recently joined WGN-AM, that's here in Chicago, although these days, because of the miracle of technology, you can hear it anywhere. My old friend, my good friend, my dear friend, Bob Surratt is the morning host on WGN 720 AM. And Bob and I, we go back all the way to the 90s. In fact, he was instrumental in my early television career. We snared a couple of trophies for some stuff we did way back in the 90s on Fox 32. Bob has done everything, radio legend in Chicago, national television, and he's now, as I mentioned, he's the morning host on WGN. So every Thursday at 7:20 a.m., which is kind of great since it's 7:20 a.m. on your dial, I'll be joining Bob for a segment where we talk about a lot of the things we talk about here, but also, things happening in the news and pop culture, movies and television, and just general observations. We've already done a couple of segments. The first one talked about the Pope being from Dalton, my hometown. Dalton, again, I'm going to say that, Dalton, because I still hear reporters saying Dalton. And by the way, thanks to AmericanEagle.com, because they are sponsors of the segment. They are sponsoring the segment, which is always a great thing. Brought to you by, yes, that's right, our friends at AmericanEagle.com. So that's on AM 720 WGN if you want to look it up or listen to it. Now they replay it, and it's also on the web. So it's a nice 10-minute segment I'm doing with Bob every week. And I'm also very pleased and proud and humbled and privileged to announce that I have joined RogerEbert.com to write about movies and television starting this week as you're listening to this podcast. Of course, Chaz Ebert, Roger's widow, runs the site along with tons of people that I've known for years who are great journalists, who are writers and editors, Brian Tallarico and several other folks there. It's a great website, RogerEbert.com. It's, so it's as you, I'm sure, know, it's mostly reviews, but there's other, sorts of things they talk about there. And what I'm going to do for RogerEbert.com, in addition to the occasional review, is write essays and columns, which is something I've always loved. As much as I love doing reviews, before I became a full-time reviewer for the Sun-Times and for other outlets, I wrote a pop culture column where a lot of times I could weigh in on, what's the significance of this, and also sometimes just a lot of fun. And I did this for the Sun-Times as well, where I'd be like, hey, it's the 40th anniversary of The Fugitive. Let's go back and here's some things you should look at. And I'd rewatch something. So I hope to do some things like that. Analysis, critiques, columns, RogerEbert.com. So I feel like I have a new home with an old friend, and I'm very excited about that. So we're keeping busy here, folks. We're going to be writing for RogerEbert.com, appearing on WGN Radio. For those of you in Chicago, although, again, you can get all this online, I'm still on Windy City Weekend on ABC 7 every Friday. And, of course, the Richard Roeper podcast. And I talked about this a month or so ago. I parted ways with the Sun-Times after 37 years, where I was writing 6 to 8 reviews, and I loved it. But I have to say, I feel kind of rejuvenated and more excited than ever before, because as much as I loved doing that for the Sun-Times, it left very little room for anything else. Sometimes it was like, oh my God, I got to get to the podcast. And I'm not saying I didn't put my full effort into it, but writing 6, 7 reviews a week means going to every screening, but also reviewing the 8-part series and the 6-part series and the 2-part documentary series. We just talked about, the Pee-wee documentary on HBO, which is great, but it just absolutely sponges up the oxygen of your life, folks. And I'm not complaining. I get it. It's a great gig, but every Sunday for the last 15 to 20 years, with a very few exceptions, family events, holidays, every Sunday, I would have 2 reviews due usually so that would be ready for the Monday and Tuesday editions of the paper, which was fine. I was used to doing it, but you get in that hamster wheel where it's like, oh God, I got to this review, 2 reviews on Tuesday, 1 review on Wednesday, 2 more I do on Thursday. Oh, in the meantime, I got to watch these 6 shows. And then sometimes I'd watch films and TV series and halfway through say, I don't think I'm going to review this. The only way I could figure that out was by watching it. So to kind of take a step back from that really cool and wonderful, but still Groundhog Day-like existence of grinding out review. And there were so many times where I wanted to write about other things, but I had to do a new, fresh review. So, for example, I would have loved to have written about the most recent season finale of The White Lotus. And, there are other people doing this, of course, or with Sinners, why has Sinners become such a huge hit? How does it, impact the way directors make deals with studios? What does it say about the culture? Why do different people have such different views of it? Isn't it just badass? So in addition to reviews, I'll be doing things like that, like I do here on the podcast. But I'm excited to get writing again. So my first piece I've already written for RogerEbert.com, and at least once a week I'll have some fresh material there. So I hope you'll find me in all these various corners of the pop culture world. And I appreciate everybody who's been listening to the podcast for the last few years. Here we go. Scarlett Johansson says Avengers Endgame should have been nominated for Best Picture. This is an interview with Vanity Fair. I love the fact that we still have, we have all these junket, snippets, and some of these reporters do a really good job in 5 minutes. They get something. And of course, we have the red carpet interviews, and we have the talk show appearances, which are more like variety show appearances. But I love when we still get these long form magazine profiles, whether it's Esquire, Vanity Fair, the New Yorker, or the writer. And there's some beautiful writing. I've always loved that long form magazine profile. And they're not necessarily, back in the day, they might be a little more critical. If you go back to what they called the new journalism, Kate Talese and Tom Wolfe back in the 60s and 70s, but they're still insightful, and it's fun to see what these stars have to say or directors have to say, and the writer spending 2 or 3 days, sometimes, multiple interviews. So this is a Vanity Fair interview, and Scarlett Johansson says that Avengers Endgame should have been nominated for Best Picture. How did this film not get nominated for an Oscar? She told Vanity Fair. It was an impossible movie that should not have worked, that works really well as a film, and also it's one of the most successful films of all time. Well, of course, we don't award box office, although we sort of do. Got 1 nomination for visual effects, was not nominated. Let's see. There have been 36 Marvel Cinematic Universe movies released, 36 and counting. Black Panther did get an Oscar nomination for Best Picture, and the MCU has won just a handful of Oscars. Black Panther won for costume design, original score, and production design, and Wakanda Forever won for costume design. But I think Scarlett Johansson has a point. She has a future as a critic, actually. She could be a TV critic, too, because she also mentioned that the Oscars were too long last year. And she mentioned when Vanity Fair said, what about that James Bond tribute? She said, well, it kind of felt like an ad placement. What a weird thing. What the hell was that? I agree with her on that, too. The Oscars are too long. I wanted to go back and look at the Best Picture nominees for the year that Avengers Endgame was eligible. And as you probably know, the Academy makes room for up to 10 Best Picture nominees, but it doesn't have to be. It can be 5. It could be 7. Most years it's 10. And that year was 9. And they have such a complicated voting system, but for whatever reason, 9 were nominated for Best Picture. 1917, the film, Ford versus Ferrari, The Irishman, Jojo Rabbit, Joker, Little Women, Marriage Story, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and Parasite, which is the winner. I look back at that, and I would have voted in a heartbeat for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I think it's one of the best movies of all time, and a movie that just gets better and better. Parasite, I get, it did great, and that's cool. I didn't love it as much as other people loved it. I didn't embrace it. I would not have voted. I definitely think it was worth being nominated. But I think Scarlett Johansson has a point. I could see, first of all, they have a 10th slot there, and Avengers Endgame is it is a good movie, and she's right. You can say there's so many things that could work against it, but that was the thing. And I think this is one of the issues that Marvel continues to deal with now, is that those movies in the 2010s, they had such a good run of great characters, beautiful production pieces, some of the action sequences, we got a lot of the CGI stuff over and over again. But you think of the actors, and there's a lot of good actors still doing them, but like it was such Hall of Fame caliber casts and compelling stories that actually had a beginning and a middle and an end. And really kind of, let's face it, man, there was some serious shit going on in these Marvel movies. And, when characters died, they actually died. Not everybody was immortal. So there was heartbreak and romance and loyalties tested. I definitely think that Endgame should have been nominated for Best Picture. And you don't even have to eliminate these other ones, but I'll tell you right now, people always say, oh, yeah, it's not a competition. And I always say, well, it's exactly a competition. It's the definition of a competition. You're pitting these movies against each other. And I think I gave positive reviews to all 9 of these films. I'm sure I did. I like Jojo Rabbit, but, it was kind of, I don't want to say a one joke, but a one concept film. And it had some, incredible flights of risk and interesting storytelling, but I don't know if it's a film that people are talking about a lot 5-6 years down the line. Marriage Story, great acting. To me, it's like, okay, I've seen Ingmar Bergman films before. The Irishman I liked. I loved, I know there's things about the de-aging and everything, but it's great. Ford versus Ferrari. Ford versus Ferrari is another film. It's really good, but it's like, I don't know if you hear people talking about it. And that's not the criteria for should it have been nominated. But, Little Women, I have to say, all due respect, and it's a good, solid adaptation. I think we've had about 8 adaptations of Little Women. So to me, like, what are people going to remember from that year and talk about? Is it going to be Avengers Endgame or Little Women? And, it's the same thing too with, I think we're getting like another take on Sense and Sensibility. And some of this stuff, I'm like, we've got a million adaptations of certain stories over and over again. So I think Scarlett makes a good point. Now, in terms of nominations, of course, Angela Bassett was nominated for Best Supporting Actress for Wakanda Forever. We're talking about superhero movies as a whole. She lost to Jamie Lee Curtis for Everything Everywhere All at Once. That was a few years after the years we're talking about here. And I love Jamie Lee Curtis. But again, I think Angela Bassett should have won there. We have had some wins, of course, for playing comic book characters, if you will. Heath Ledger, of course, won for Best Supporting Actor for playing the Joker. And then Joaquin Phoenix for Joker. So we had a supporting actor and a best actor. In terms of some performances that I think should have been nominated or certainly were award worthy. If you go all the way back to the original Superman with Christopher Reeve, you got to remember that this was a time when superhero movies were not a thing anymore, or there have been a few here and there. But this is decades before the renaissance of the superhero movie and the comic book movie. So we had more of the people were thinking, this Superman and Batman and Spider-Man. All those characters were either cartoons or live action cartoons in the 60s and 70s. And then they decided to make it's relatively lighthearted compared to some of the other, Justice League and stories like that we've had. But original Superman was a phenomenon, and Christopher Reeve was perfectly cast because he looked like Superman and he embodied the innocence of Clark Kent and the heroics of Superman. And when you go back and look at that movie, man, that was a big deal at the theaters. I remember when the original Superman came out. So if Christopher Reeve had been nominated for Superman, that wouldn't have been that crazy. A lot of people talk about Robert Downey Jr., and I've just said this for years. If you go back to the first Iron Man, and go back and it's like, man, that is such a good film. And again, it's got a heavy dark side to it as well. And the thing about the Robert Downey Jr. Performance as Iron Man is he's not playing Iron Man. He's playing Tony Stark, who takes on a persona of Iron Man. It's sort of like, you have some superhero characters who are who they are. They don't really have alter egos. Somewhat they do. But then you have your Peter Parker Spider-Man. You have your Bruce Wayne Batman. And you have Tony Stark is the character there who, and Robert Downey Jr. is brilliant. If you put that same performance in a different type of movie, just a movie about a billionaire industrialist arms dealer who then has eventually a crisis of conscience, but often acts in his own self-interest, it's a brilliant performance. Christian Bale, of course, for Batman Begins could have been nominated. I think Hugh Jackman, he's played Wolverine so many times, but Logan, right? I think that was the R-rated one, right? But you look at that performance. That's a pure performance, man. And I know it's become very fashionable and popular to say Gal Gadot can't act, and there are all kinds of other opinions about her. But if you go back to the first Wonder Woman, really strong performance, maybe not quite Academy Award nomination worthy, but strong work. Scarlett herself as Black Widow, very good. And then you want to go back another generation, look at what Jack Nicholson did with Joker. Now in the Batman. Now, that, of course, that was a completely different interpretation from what we got, the dark Heath Ledger performance and the psychotic, version that Joaquin Phoenix gave us. But there have certainly been performances in comic book movies, superhero movies, if you will, that are worthy of award mention, at least. All right, we're going to take a break. And then I want to talk about a new release, a new documentary, true crime series that Chicagoans in particular will never forget. All right, it's time to tell you about Portillo's, the greatest single fast casual cuisine experience you're ever in your life. Let's talk about the hot dogs and all the famous Chicago ingredients. They'll do it for you, so you don't have to worry about getting it wrong. That includes the poppy seed bun. Then we could talk about the Italian beef, the sausage, and the fries, the salad, the chicken, you name it, all topped up, of course, with the legendary Portillo's chocolate cake. It's fast casual. That means it's better than fast food. You can sit down if you go to one of the restaurants, but it's still super casual. And you can order anywhere in the country via Portillos.com. That's Portillos.com. Once again, Portillos.com. Ask your friends from Chicago about it. Portillos.com. There's a new 3-part documentary series called Cold Case, The Tylenol Murders. It's the latest installment in the Cold Case franchise on Netflix.
I was 8 years old. I remember my mom coming out of the bathroom and saying, "I feel weird."
They said, "My brother Adam got a heart attack." I says, "What are you talking about? He's a very healthy person."
Paula was murdered. She was just murdered.
The next I know, I'm watching my mom go out on a stretcher.
These are not all heart attacks. Something's killing them.
There were 6 capsules missing, and there are 3 victims. I said, it has to be Tylenol.
They're barking up the wrong tree. They will never solve the Tylenol homicides.
Now the product is triple sealed. There is absolutely no reason that this could ever happen again, but it happens.
The entire narrative suddenly looks a little more suspect.
You have to follow the evidence, wherever the evidence takes you.
Remember, they did the series about the death of JonBenet Ramsey. So the Tylenol Murders, and there was a documentary series a few years ago about the Tylenol Murders, and we've had a few books and podcasts, but kind of interesting to me. And I say this with all great and due respect for the losses suffered and the families who suffered and the murder victims. But it is kind of interesting to me from the standpoint of, a critic, that we've never gotten a dramatic limited series or theatrical film about the Tylenol Murders as we have with, Zodiac and the Jeffrey Dahmer series and Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer and so many other Mindhunter series and or films that were based on true stories. There have been all kinds of movies about Ted Bundy. And I think one of the reasons is because the Tylenol case, if you don't know about it, I'll lay out the basics in a second, but because they were poisonings, there was not really, they were horrific murders, but it doesn't have the sensational, violent aspects of some of the other series and movies that were based on real life cases. Son of Sam, the Spike Lee film, where you had these serial killers, murderers. Now the Tylenol murderer or murderers, and the case remains unsolved, were just as vicious and evil and monstrous, but they were poisonings, and the crime scenes were not really. It happened mostly they died at their homes or visiting somebody else. But this was in 1982, and this story was insane. You had there was some in the suburbs and some in the city, but it started off with one man who I think wasn't, stayed home from work, wasn't feeling well, took a couple of Tylenols, and then was rushed to the hospital. And at first they thought it was a heart attack. Now, the family of this man, they all gathered at his home, and this included his brother and his sister-in-law. And they were so grief-stricken and so upset that they took Tylenol from the same bottle that their loved one had, and they died in rapid succession. So all of a sudden, you had three family members who were healthy and young in their 20s, or in case of young Teresa, she was 19, I believe, the sister-in-law of the first victim. All of a sudden, you had three people who died, who had been healthy, who died instantly. And the documentary Cold Case of Tylenol Murders, they talked to the fire chief from, I believe it's Arlington Heights. They talked to a community health nurse who were there at the time and other officials. And they said, something's going on here. And it was the nurse who saw the Tylenol bottle and said, it's got to be the Tylenol. And they've quickly ascertained that somebody had tampered with the capsules and had put put cyanide in the capsules, which acts very quickly. And just like you see in the movies where they take those cyanide capsules. In other cases of poisoning, you would have several days before someone succumbed. In this case, these cases, it happened very quickly. And then there was a young girl who had stayed home sick from school. There was a flight attendant. There were a total of 7 people who had taken Tylenol, extra strength Tylenol, I believe it was, the capsules, and had died. And law enforcement, and I got to remember, this is 1982. So, there's not social media. It takes a while, to kind of figure this out, and cops and paramedics and health officials talking to each other. And then they realized that the common thread here was that these capsules had been laced with cyanide. So Mayor Jane Byrne of Chicago called this midnight press conference saying all Tylenol should be removed off shelves immediately. And if you have Tylenol, either turn it in, because they actually were advocating not just throwing it out, but turning it in so that they could, Johnson & Johnson, the McNeil Laboratory, the parent companies could, see if there were more boxes and capsules laced with cyanide. So it was a terrifying time in Chicago. And then, of course, nationwide, it became a huge story because it was like, who would do such a thing? And the documentary gets into it. There's a guy named James Lewis who was a longtime prime suspect. He wrote an extortion letter to Johnson & Johnson saying, you need to send $1 million to this bank account because it's so easy for anyone to lace these capsules with cyanide. It was kind of like the Zodiac when he'd write those letters. But this thing they quickly figured out who had sent the letter. The documentary goes into all the reasons why. And then they tracked James Lewis down in New York City, and he eventually is convicted of extortion, but not of the murders. The prosecutors never felt they had enough evidence to put him in Chicago at the time of the murders. He was in New York. He had alibis, although it was also determined, again, in this day and age, it would have been pretty easy for him to take a train under an assumed identity and get back to Chicago in time. Guy served 11 years. And they actually have the last interview with James Lewis about a year before he died. And it's just chilling. And other theories out there about the case, other suspects. There's all these twists and turns, too, in the Tylenol story, because there was law enforcement officials in Kansas City, I believe it's Kansas City, who were convinced that he had murdered someone there. Then there was another guy who was briefly detained as a suspect, a Chicago guy, who had, he had a lot of materials in his home and had reason to be disgruntled. And a bar owner had reportedly turned him in to police. Now, this guy, it turns out, was not the guy, and police let him go. But then this guy was so mad at the bar owner who turned him into police or told police about him that he shot and killed the guy, but he killed the wrong guy. He killed a guy who looked, not that the bar owner was the right guy, but in other words, he killed somebody who had nothing to do with it. He saw somebody who resembled the guy he was targeting, and he killed him. So some people, kind of call him the 8th victim in the Tylenol case. And then on top of all that, like 4 years after the 1982 Tylenol murders in Westchester County, New York, a young woman died after taking a Tylenol that had been laced with cyanide. Was it a copycat? Was the killer still at loose? Documentary gets into that. There are no answers. James Lewis, as I said, died and to the end maintained his innocence. A lot of law enforcement personnel who were involved with the case are absolutely convinced that he's the guy, that he was the guy. So fascinating documentary on Netflix. For those of you, younger folks out there, one of the things that came from the Tylenol murders was the advent of tamper-resistant packaging. Now, there had been some before that. You know what they call those blister packs, like when you get pills and they're on those little individual sealed things. Those went back to like the 60s. But as you'll see in the documentary in the early 80s, it actually said on the bottle of Tylenol something to the effect that this is not child resistant, because there were already some measures in place where you had to twist a knob, cap a certain way or line up the arrows. And that was to keep the kids, from little ones from opening stuff, and adults could figure it out. But the Tylenol at the time just came in a cardboard box with little flaps. It was not glued together. There was no plastic shrink wrap. There was no foil sealant. So whether it was done in Johnson & Johnson laboratories or facilities, McNeil facilities, and they maintained they didn't, and there were lawsuits and back and forth, or it was done by someone or actually was James Lewis. So what you could have done at the time was either in a warehouse or in the store itself, or you could buy Tylenol. You could just unscrew the caplets and pour out the white powdery substance, and then put cyanide in and just put them back together, and just put the thing right back on the shelf. There was nothing in place, and it would take a matter of minutes to do that. So after that, Tylenol, Johnson & Johnson, they had to take millions and millions and millions of bottles off the shelves. And at the time, Tylenol was the biggest selling product in the Johnson & Johnson empire, billions and billions of dollars. And of course, sales went way down. They did a remarkable job. First of all, I thought they owned it. Hey, we don't believe that this happened in our facilities, but we're going to do everything we can to make this right. They did destroy all those bottles, and some people said, well, maybe they should have gone through all of them to see if there was more cyanide. But they did come back strong, and there were federal regulations, and that's why now pretty much everything you buy comes in shrink wrap packaging, or has, you get a gallon of milk and there's that seal, and there's signs saying if this seal is broken, don't use this product. And if you do get a bottle of Tylenol now, the flaps are glued together, and then you have that plastic wrap that you have to take off, and then you open it up, and then there's usually the foil seal. And if any of those things aren't there, and that's why we use the term tamper resistant, because people could still do things, but it'd be a hell of a lot more difficult, and the warning signs would be there. So that's the resonance of this. Of course, the lasting tragedy is those innocent people. It was just by pure, horrific coincidence if you picked a bottle off the shelf, and we don't know to this day that, there's the school of thought that says there might have been more victims, because if an older person took it and just died, they might not have done an autopsy. It's not like you had all these sudden signs of, like foaming at the mouth and all this other sorts of things. Or what if somebody was driving a car and had an accident and it was because they had passed out? We don't know, because it seems likely that there were more bottles. And also some families, thank God, were probably spared simply because they heard the warnings from the mayor, or police officers were knocking door to door or going down streets with loudspeakers saying, don't take Tylenol. So of the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of bottles and capsules and packets of Tylenol that were either thrown out or returned to the company, somebody might have had a box with cyanide-laced Tylenol in their bathroom on their kitchen counter and heard the warnings and turned it in. So it could have been even worse. So the documentary is called Cold Case, The Tylenol Murders. Yes, heavy stuff, but very well done. 3-part documentary series. Check it out if you can. All right. Thanks to everybody for listening once again. I'm Richard Roeper, and we will be back next week with another podcast for you.